Let's do a problem preparing a flexible budget. So the Gundy Company expects to produce 1,203,600 units of its product during the upcoming year. Monthly production is expected to range from 72,700 up to 116,100 units. Budgeted variable manufacturing costs per unit are direct materials $3, direct labor $6, and overhead $11. Budgeted fixed manufacturing overhead cost per unit are $4 for depreciation and $3 for supervision. So when we are preparing a flexible budget, we are essentially creating a budget for varying levels of activity. And what they're asking us to do is to prepare a flexible manufacturing budget. The concept of preparing a flexible budget can be applied to this example, which is a flexible manufacturing budget, or it could be a flexible income statement or a flexible budgeted balance sheet or a flexible sales budget, right? It doesn't really matter what budget that we are creating a flexible budget for. The concept is still the same. Okay, in order to prepare a flexible budget, we need to know for variable cost what the variable cost is per unit. Okay, so they have made it pretty easy for us, and they've already given us the variable cost per unit. The direct materials, direct labor, and overhead cost in their budgeting will be incurred. And they have also told us that the budgeted fixed manufacturing overhead cost, what they're planning or expecting. What they're asking us to do is prepare budgets for a range of monthly production. So they want to know, what would our budget look like if we only produce 72,700 units, and normally they will produce anywhere between that low level up to this higher level of production. So they have asked us to prepare a budget within that range of 21,700 unit increments. Okay, and what do they mean by relevant? Well, the relevant range means that if they produce anywhere within this range, the behavior of these costs will remain as variable for the materials, labor, and overhead, and fixed for depreciation and supervision. Okay, and if we get outside of this range of production, it could be that the behavior of some of those costs will change. Okay, but because we're staying within this relevant range, we can assume that these costs will always be variable and these costs will always be fixed. So we're going to first prepare a budget for the lower level of production, 72,700 units produced, and then in increments of 21,700 units, we're going to jump up and prepare a budget for 94,400 units produced, and we are going to prepare a budget for 116,100, which is another 21,700 units increase. Now, what this problem is having us practice is just flexing a budget. Okay, so essentially what we're doing is we're creating a budget for 3 different levels. For example, if we are budgeting for 72,700 units produced, the cost that we expect to incur at that level of production will be $3 in material costs per unit produced. To come up with the total budgeted material costs at that range, we're going to multiply the activity, 72,700 units produced, times the variable cost per unit for materials of 3. So 72,700 times 3, we are budgeting materials of 218,100. Do the same thing for labor. 72,700 units produced at a direct labor cost of $6 per unit. 436,200 is the budgeted direct labor. Overhead is $11 per unit, 72,700 units at $11 per unit, $799.7. Adding up my variable cost, if we produce 72,700 units, we are budgeting for total variable costs of $1,454,000. Now we need to budget for the fixed costs they will anticipate to incur if they produce 72,700 units. The problem information had given us 1,203,600 units for an entire year. And based off of that expected level of production, which is their static budget or their original budgeted production, they have estimated depreciation at $4 per unit, supervision at $3. So in order to get the total annual depreciation that they're expecting, I need to multiply the 1,203,000 budgeted units to produce times the $4 per unit. In total for the entire year, they are expecting $4,814,400 in depreciation. Now remember, fixed costs are fixed. No matter what level of production they have, those costs will always be the same, right? As long as we stay within that relevant range. So if that's 4,814,000 and change for the entire year, if I divide that by 12, they are budgeting for 401,200 in fixed depreciation costs each month. Same thing for the supervision, 1,203,600 static budget, total units produced for the upcoming year, budgeted at $3 per unit in supervision fixed cost. They are anticipating total supervision fixed costs of $3,610,800 for the year. If I divide that by 12, I come up with budgeted fixed supervision costs of $300,900. Okay, so this problem was a little bit strange because they gave us our fixed costs on a per unit basis based off of a budget of 1,203,000 annual production. So we kind of had to back into what the monthly fixed costs are expected to be. What we have now done is we created a budget for 72,700 units, the amount of costs, variable and fixed, that they expect. Now we're going to prepare a budget for the next incremental level of production, 94,400 units. Multiply the level of activity times the variable costs per unit, 94,400 times variable direct materials of 3, budgeted direct material costs 283.2. 94,400 units produced times the labor costs of 6, budgeting 566.4 for labor cost. Budgeted level of activity 94.4 times the variable cost per unit of 11 for overhead, budgeting 1,038.4 in overhead cost. For 94,400 units produced, total budgeted variable cost of 1,888,000. Fixed cost, if we produce 94,400, will be exactly the same as if we were producing 72,700. Because remember, fixed costs stay the same regardless of the level of activity. Totaling up our variable and our fixed cost, we expect manufacturing cost to be 2,591,000 if we produce 94,400 units. Finally, for 116,100 unit monthly production, see if I can type here, 116,100, variable cost per unit for materials of 3, budgeting direct material costs of 348.3. Direct labor will be 116,100 times $6 per unit variable cost, 696.6. 116,100 times the $11 overhead cost per unit, budgeting 1,277,100 for overhead cost. Total variable cost for a expected level of production of 116.1, 2,322,000. Going down to the fixed cost at this level of activity will be the same as they were at the other two levels of activity because fixed costs are fixed, they don't change. So we now have total budgeted fixed cost for 3 levels of activity. Okay. By flexing a budget, it will make it a lot more informative to create a performance report, because what we can now do is take whatever the actual level of activity is and compare it to a budget that is based on the same level of activity. So let's go ahead and do one of those examples. All right, so let me get this pulled up a little bit for us and pull up our responsibility report, which is also known as a performance report. When a company is trying to evaluate their actuals when compared to their budget, the most important thing is we want to make sure that we're comparing our actuals to a budget that is based off of the same level of activity. Okay, so that prior problem that we just did, we learned how to flex a budget. We took a budget based off of one particular level of activity and we flexed it to varying level of activity. Okay. What we're going to do in this problem is we are now going to take the the flexible budget and compare it to the actual results. So they have given us a manufacturing overhead budget for the first quarter of the year, and then they have given us our actual costs for that first quarter. They have indicated here that the actual level of activity equaled the budgeted level. So we already have a budget here based off of the same level of activity. Okay, so we don't need to flex this budget, right? So I taught you in that first problem how to flex a budget. We now have a budget that is based off of the same level of activity. Okay? So I'm going to simply bring all of my budgeted costs into my responsibility report, which is also known as a performance report. So I've got indirect material, indirect labor, utilities, and maintenance. Okay, now this problem is indicating that we are preparing a performance responsibility report just for one specific department, and we're only going to include costs that are controllable by that manager. Here, this has told us that all costs are controllable except for depreciation, property taxes, and insurance. So we are not going to include any of the non-controllable costs. Right? So we only want to evaluate based off of what costs the supervisor has control over. Okay. When we prepare a responsibility or a performance report for a full balance sheet or a full income statement, we can include all costs, right? But here we're only going to include some costs that this particular manager had control over. So we have the budget for that level of activity on this report. I'm going to bring in my actuals for materials, labor, utilities, maintenance, and then the actual fixed cost for property taxes and insurance were $9,000. So bringing my actual amounts in, hardest part is done. We have a budget at the same level of activity as the actual costs were incurred, and we have our budgeted amounts. Now we're just going to simply compare the budget to the actual. Budget for indirect materials for this level of activity was $11,400. Actual indirect material costs were $14,700. The dollar difference is $3,300. That is unfavorable, right? We would prefer to have our actual costs below what we budget or estimated. Indirect labor. The budget was for $11,000. Our actual costs were $9,300. Our actuals were less than our budget by $1,700. That is favorable. right? We would prefer to have our actual expenses less than our budget. Utilities, $1,400 difference between actual and budget, and it's unfavorable because the actuals exceeded the budget. Maintenance, $1,400 difference. Actuals were less than budget for maintenance costs. That is favorable. Supervisor salaries. There was no variance, right? So it's neither favorable or unfavorable. We kind of had our supervision salaries right at what we expected. So what do we do with this? Well, this is where we call management by exception. This draws our attention to areas where there might be some concerns, right? We might be concerned that our indirect materials and our utility costs were so much higher than what we had planned. We need to start asking questions. Why, right? Was there something that happened that we can correct to control our costs better in the future? Or is it something that was out of our control and our budget was just not really well planned or accurate? We can also use this to direct our attention to where things went well, right? Favorable variances for our cost. We did a good job controlling costs. Maybe we should think about, trying to continue doing that in the future. Let's identify why our costs were controlled pretty well. So ultimately what the performance report does is it directs our attention to areas that looked good and areas that maybe there's some adjustments that we can make to improve future cost control. All right, hopefully this helps. Reach out with any questions.